we go. Hey, welcome back to the Healing Conversation Mapping Consciousness Part 2. Last week we spent some time looking at the consciousness of the coronavirus, and it's continuing to work me to find that softening. Today was another example of a conversation that didn't go in the kind and loving way that I always hope that these things go, but I didn't project and I didn't defend. I just stepped away, and I think that's the best I can do in situations like that. And so I'm continuing to feel excited about where we're going with this conversation. And tonight is what was originally supposed to happen last week, but for all the reasons I spoke about last week, it got put off a week. So let me go ahead and share my slides and give you guys the view. Okay, so I did go over some of this material. Lee will recognize it from the Wave Street series. This was the night on New Year's Eve when the title of the session was called Going to School on Our Wounding. And I shared a little bit of this map of consciousness with the intention of someday unpacking it further, and today is that day. At the beginning of that session, I shared this quote from the Hopi Nation, and so I want to do the same here as well, because I think it's such a beautiful way to think about where our deepest wisdom is coming from. Creation said, "I want to hide something from the humans until they're ready for it. It is the realization that they can create their own reality." The eagle said, "Give it to me, I will take it to the moon." The Creator said, "No, one day they'll go there and find it." The salmon said, "I will bury it at the bottom of the ocean." And the Creator said, "No, they'll go there too." The buffalo said, "I will bury it in the Great Plains." And the Creator said, "They will cut into the skin of the earth and find it even there." Grandmother, who lives at the breast of Mother Earth and who has no physical eyes but sees with spiritual eyes, said, "Put it inside them." And the Creator said, "It is done." Bless you, Karen. So
thank you.
This wisdom, this inner knowing, this I'm not crazy, you have it too, trust that I am operating under, is a beautiful blend of lived experience and also what I would consider grace. And so this quote from Anne Lamott lays it out beautifully. It says, "I do not understand the mystery of grace, only that it meets us where we are, but it does not leave us where it found us." And then, this is, I think, the truth of the human experience is that there's only so much that we can think ourselves through, and the rest we have to feel our way through. And so I've been sitting with that part of my wounding where not trusting my own physical story, my own body, sort of ruled the day for many, many years. But the way home, the way to heal that divide within myself has been this reattunement to my inner navigation system, what I call our bio-navigation system. I believe that our bodies have this deep well of wisdom and discernment that if we are quiet enough and still enough and learn to really feel into what truth feels like in our bodies, there's an ease with it. There's a trust with it, that we can navigate everything that's coming our way. And if we just stopped with that idea, the idea that we have all of the wisdom we need, that compass to take us home, we could still get pretty far. But my brain is inductive and deductive. So I wanted to sort of nail down what some of the sort of known landscape of the path to consciousness looks like. And this, I think the beginnings of this was when I did a TED Talk a few years ago, and it was all about synchronicities and learning to trust them. I was fascinated by the idea of synchronicities, that there could be within the human story some dance with the universe, that we could have a conversation if not with the universe, with our own higher state of consciousness. And so I began to really expand my awareness from not just the synchronicities, but also what are the other things that show up along the way that are, if somebody writes a book about synchronicities and you can instantly relate to what they're describing, which is The Power of Grace by David Rico. I read that book 3 times and I kept coming back to that section on synchronicities and going, okay, this is a lot like when I've done medicine work and somebody else describes what I saw through their experience. And I thought, oh, there really is sort of a matrix or a map or a knowable place that can be found in all of us. So I began to put some language around my sort of moments of awareness through this journey. And so I'm going to go through these in a little more detail as I sort of look at my timeline here. But, clearly there's an original wound. There is a moment where our innocence is lost, a place where we go from being that wide-eyed, beautiful, curious, pure potentiality of innocence to a place of self-consciousness, where we become aware that we're separate from. And I believe that that's in service. If there is a great creator, or we are the creator, or however you want to hold that model in your mind, that it makes sense to me. There is a logic that we had to move through the darkness to come into the light. That we would, if love only knows expansion, and that is my theory of the case, that it would expand the most as we came through the darkness. Like if everything was hunky-dory and we never had sorrow and we never had grief and we never had opposition, we would never learn compassion. We would never learn the depth and the height of joy and happiness. We would only be experiencing that. And so it's in the contrast of light and dark that we gain the most access to the potentiality of love in every moment of our existence. And so that original wound, that innocence lost, I believe is baked into the story. If you go through the biblical model, it's Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And Eve got blamed for the whole thing. Adam didn't do a very good job. He kind of threw her under the bus, and she was forever treated poorly thereafter. I mean, the whole feminine, we've been suffering ever since. The masculine has decided that we're the reason that, that good and evil thing happened. And, we could talk all night long about how the feminine, and maybe we'll spend a night on the feminine, but that innocence lost is sort of a universal thread in just about every theological discipline, that somewhere along the way we went from innocence to innocence lost. And so that sort of starts this map in motion, this place of set and setting. There's a wonderful movie, a documentary on Netflix called Lottery of Birth, and it does an incredible job of sort of laying out the case that depending upon where you're born on this planet, who you're born to, you arrive in a set and setting, some with privilege, some without, some with religion, some with, that basically the idea that we are, a clean slate when we arrive is not really true. We arrive into a set and setting that begins to create a container for our life experience. And so that original wound is baked into all of our stories, but depending upon the set and setting of that wounding, that point of separation, it can either be an individuated level, a natural maturation of our story, or it can be a major wound that we have to work through the rest of our life. Like some of us got a master class in healing in this lifetime. I look at Lee, she's going through a master class in healing right now with her body and all that she's working through right now. So there is something that happens in that original set and setting that begins to put us on the path of our hero's journey. And if we become aware of all of the factors of that set and setting, we begin to sort of open up our mind to the potentiality that that isn't all that's there for us, that there's more available to us. So we set out on our life path, and I found along the way that there are sort of moments that have a deep spiritual gravity, something that stands out, jumps out, holds you in its grasp of attention in a way that few other things do. And Lee and I have talked about one in her past where she had a voice bigger than her own courage thought she had, to stand up for the rights of another. And it was in that moment that she began to realize that she could present courageously for others, and maybe also for herself in that moment. So it had some depth, some spiritual gravity to it. I don't remember much about my childhood, but the 4 or 5 events that stand out to me each have some spiritual weightiness to them. There's some density. Can you guys relate to what I'm saying about spiritual gravity? Can you relate to a moment?
Yes.
Can you give me examples?
Absolutely.
Give me one, Karen. I love to hear these.
Okay. So there's a couple of things. One was when I was taking a bath. I remember living in the house we lived in. I lived in there from age 4 to age 7. And I remember I was in the bathtub, and all of a sudden this thing came over me. And I just felt suddenly giddily happy. And I'm in the bathtub. And so then I get out of the bathtub, and my mother was outside pulling weeds around the front yard, around the flowers. And the neighborhood we lived in was a busy city street. We were near the Oldsmobile factory. So the fact that she was trying to put flowers there, and I came out and I'm in tears, but I'm in happy tears. And I said, Mommy, I'm so happy. I'm so sorry if I've ever made you unhappy. And I'm crying. I'm so happy. And my mother didn't know quite what to say about it. So she said, don't cry. The neighbors will think I hit you or something. And I was not struck as a child. That wasn't part of the rearing. And then I had another time in the field across the street, and I'm 7. And I'm walking through the field, and I'm asking whatever I'm asking. Why do I feel different? Why am I different? Why? What's going on? Why do I feel separate or different? And I'm 7 and I'm asking nothing. I'm out in the field. It wasn't a field, it was a vacant lot, but at 7 it was a field.
It's a field.
And so I've had those moments in my life that I have not forgotten. I remember how I felt.
Yes.
I have just not forgotten it. Is that what you're talking about?
That's exactly. I watched you as you told me that, and you closed your eyes and you physically went back to that place. It anchors in your body. You have to pull it from your somatic memory to really hold the memory. One of my first ones was I was just shy of my 4th birthday. And I know that because it was this time of year where it's warm during the day and Indian summer nights. And our house was on a hill, and so it had sort of a staggered foundation, and there was this little niche underneath the dining room window, kind of under the fireplace, that was just right for a 3 3/4-year-old little girl to hide and seek with my 3 brothers, and that was my go. They knew where to find me because that's where I went. So it was a little cocoon space for me. And that night in particular, our parents had sort of kicked us out of the house because they were fighting. And I can remember the dining room window open, and it was hot, and they were fighting, and it was pretty intense. And my brothers were all under the house looking at Playboy magazines, which was another feature of the story of my life. And I remember, like you, asking a really big question, like, I had just learned about the idea of eternity, and I thought, if this is eternity like this, man, why am I here? This doesn't make any sense to me. This isn't how life is. This is not who we are. I mean, I had such a sense of self-awareness at such a young age, that I can feel the warmth of the stucco of the house and its bumpiness on my bare little skin and arms, but I can also feel the warmth of the concrete under my bottom. I mean, it's so viscerally
Yeah.
in the body, that memory, that moment of spiritual gravity. Lee, can you relate to one of those?
Yeah. I mean, since you were just mentioning the one where I was helping my friend, that's at the forefront of my mind at this point. And you know, I somehow had just the right knowledge that came from nowhere to support her in doing what she needed to do. And watching her do that was empowering for me.
Yeah.
At the same time. And I'd always kind of gone, how did I do that? How did I know how that worked? And yeah, just full body awe.
Yes. So my sort of interpretation of that is we are meeting small self, avatar, Edie, got to meet big self, big S, fully conscious Edie. Like there was a part of me that still exists in what I'll call the collective consciousness, and it was fully present with that little girl, in a way that brought wisdom and confidence to me. It was a grounding stake in my timeline that I've got several of them now that I could sort of, and they have a momentum to them. Because they're indelible in our physical awareness, they never fade. They build on each other. The next time you have one, you recognize it. There's a resonance of self in those moments that can catch us off guard. There's awe to them, but there's also sort of a trust about them that comes maybe more in retrospect, and that's where the accumulation starts to really have some weightiness in our stories, some strength to it. But I think if we began to share out loud these landmarks, people would begin to recognize that their higher self, their big S consciousness, has been there all along. And we often refer to it as the woo-woo. We refer to it as the part of our story that seems childlike, and like my imaginary friend, I know, was probably a way of reconciling this higher self, keeping me safe through much of what I was going through. The dissociative Edie needed a pal, somebody to help her stay present. So these spiritual gravity moments, if we were in ceremony together right now, I'd be passing around this piece of meteorite that was brought to me when we built Grace Sanctuary, and it's amazingly dense and heavy compared to another type of metal that you might find from here on earth. And it always reminds me that these moments of spiritual gravity, they have a different specific gravity. They're more spiritually dense, and you start to notice them more if you give them the due that they are sort of messenger moments between you and your higher self. And then there are things like pivot points, where you have snow globe moments, like the end of a relationship and everything's up for grabs, where you can kind of look at your life and go, I really don't have to keep living it the way I've been living it. Like when I left my ex-husband in the church on the same day at age 36, it was a major pivot for me. I just realized I was going to be changing the entire trajectory of my life in that moment. And trajectory can be a really funny thing. It may not feel like a huge shift, but a small shift here over time. If you've ever watched a HGTV, What's Wrong with This House show, they'll show you where the floor is off by a half inch on one end of the room and 6 inches 12 feet away, right? Like there is an algorithmic expansion that happens when you make a shift of consciousness. It brings into the field a whole new trajectory of possibilities.
Can I ask a question, Edie?
Yeah, of course.
In regards to you and maybe people in general, and if I remember your story, you were so immersed in the church. You were so immersed in all of this, your entire being, all the hours you were teaching it. And then you did this shift. So aren't there degrees of shift? Yours was dramatic and intervention instant.
Yes.
And then there's some interventions that, you know, this happens, and then there's the
Yes.
So there's different ways. Yeah.
All of it. Sometimes the shift could just be as something as simple as deciding that you're not going to engage with a particular person anymore. Like it can be, and they don't even know you're not engaging with them. You've just energetically closed a door between you and somebody else because you finally set a boundary of self-care, and they're not even aware. It's not dramatic. It's just this subtle, quiet reorientation, like the compass, the bio-navigation system starts to really show us what alignment looks like. Can you think of a pivot point in your life, Karen, where you just said, oh, I'm ready to go do something? And sometimes it's because of a death of a loved one. Sometimes it's because of where we decide to go to school. I mean, can you relate to this idea of a pivot point, either of you? Lee? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I would say my divorce was a big pivot point in, you know, changing course on the direction of my life and opening up to new possibilities for myself that I had been limiting.
Right, right. There is an awareness in the pivot that you are freeing yourself from something and accessing something else, that, you know, that door closes, window opens awareness. Karen, for you?
I can think of two, like Lee, the decision to get a divorce after nearly 40 years of marriage. It wasn't a sudden decision. I ended up being fine. The other one was a painful one, but ended up, I could feel the difference. My firstborn child was stillborn, and at the time I was a school teacher. And so when I came back to school, my whole sense of the beingness of the children had shifted. And there was just a whole sense of their beingness. It wasn't, I'm in charge of these children, that I could sort of feel their beingness and more. I was considered a loving teacher, but it was just some other kind of connection.
You had a deep connection with them because of what happened to you.
Yes.
Losing your own child. Yeah. So that's a painful and also very tender realization to have about suffering, that sometimes through suffering we gain insights and access parts of ourselves that we might not have otherwise, right? This is This is why we have to, this is the piece of life happening for us, not to us. Even the really hard stuff can serve up a pivot point. Like, it just, watching people have a lot of drama in their lives, and what happens when that drama becomes to such a degree a debilitation in their own body. Like, I had so much drama with my ex-husband that when it took me almost a year of being out of that relationship before I realized what a huge shift I was making in my life. So it isn't always in the moment. Sometimes it's, you see it in retrospect. You might not feel like you're in the middle of a pivot, but there is, at the end of the day, you look back and go, wow, that really changed how I see the world. That changed how I related to others, how I related to myself. It changed functionally how I am in the world. So those pivot points, I'm putting language to things that we might look at a timeline and go, oh man, that was a complete disruption, and what a setback, and what a horrible thing to go through. But if we just recognize that pivot points are part of the story that help us recalibrate to our true north, to our true self, then maybe we don't fear them so much. Maybe we could look at what's happening in the world right now as a pivot point. I think COVID is a tremendous pivot, right? With lots of room to go deeper and darker, or move towards a more healed state of being on this planet. I mean, these pivot points in the moment can be quite distressing because they stir up our nervous system. They disrupt our certainty about things. But if we understand that that's part of the nature of expansion in this human experience, then maybe we don't treat them with such fear, or interpret them through such a fear-based lens, but just curiosity about, oh, I wonder why we have to have a fire come to our back door. I wonder what that's, that was a major pivot point for us. It was a trial, and it was certainly very distressing. And I think I still have a little bit of PTSD from it, but it also opened up a whole new lens of perception about what we want to do with our land. And so understanding that pivot points are a natural order of things in the human story takes some of that uncertainty off the table. Breadcrumbs to the soul. These are those little tiny things that you read something and a particular phrase jumps out at you, a particular quote can't be left behind because it has an impact, a particular image. I can still think about this one instrument I wanted so badly. It was a little steel drum, and I didn't buy it, and I just couldn't justify treating myself to such a little $199 luxury back then. And that little breadcrumb to my soul has taught me more lessons about, if it calls to you 3 times, pay attention. And that called to me like 60 times, and I never gave myself that attention. So breadcrumbs to the soul are little sparkly objects that your soul gets you to focus in on a little bit, little invitations to explore some piece of yourself in a new way. Can you relate to that? What a breadcrumb to your soul might look like? Lee, you got one?
Yeah, I have an example of one that, I wasn't expecting it, but I was listening to a podcast. I think it was Getting Curious with Jonathan Van Ness, and he was interviewing somebody who studied plants, and they were talking about plant consciousness and what does that mean, and what, when you're studying plant consciousness, what type of things are they looking at. And there was one example that stuck really hard with me, that was that plants can, if they're being attacked by something,
Mm-hmm.
they can, some of them are able to choose to let off a certain sugar or a certain hormone that would attract an insect that they believe would protect them.
Mm.
And so they actually have a biological process when something is happening that recruits help from outside of themselves.
So that's a beautiful little mimicry moment to notice what nature does. How did you interpret that? How did that breadcrumb land in your soul?
Well, it just really got me stuck on the interest of consciousness isn't just for humans. There is varying degrees of consciousness and many different types of consciousness around, and it made me feel connected to nature, to other things around me other than humans. I felt
Mm-hmm.
more of a connection to that.
Nice, nice. Okay, that's a great example of something that hits you and works you. Like, it grabs a hold of some piece of your imagination that brings you to a different lens of perception on something than what you had before, right?
Yes, and I listened to that bit of information, and I sought more information, and I started reading all this other stuff, and then I connected that, oh, there's so much more to this consciousness than
Right.
I'd ever imagined.
Right. And for somebody like you who had, and I'm sharing what you've shared with me before, gone through so much as in your childhood adverse experience, your ACE score is pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
You had developed a lot of armory around yourself, not trusting the connections to anything around you. You had become very self-contained. And so a little breadcrumb to your soul that says, hey, there's bigger thing to consciousness, like we're connected in ways that we aren't even aware of, right? So your soul, that's why I call them breadcrumbs to your soul, is they are little awakenings, little moments of, oh, I really like that idea. That's healing to me. That new lens of perception brings a little more light to my soul, a little more peace in my soul. Karen, can you relate to a breadcrumb in your story?
Yeah, it goes back to kids again. I have some plant stories too, because my attachment to nature and life as all one anyway. But back to the story with the kids, I was talking about my feeling, this different feeling towards kids. The first time I recognized that at all was when a young lady stayed in from recess because she wasn't getting her math. And I always made myself available if the kids wanted to stay in. And I was teaching 5th grade at the time, if they needed help. So she came up to ask for some help, and she just started crying. And she said, I'm sorry, I'm not upset with you. I just don't get my math. So what I did, and I didn't even think about it, was go over to her and put my arms around her, and I said, how amazing you are to be identifying and knowing what is the source of your discontent. You are amazing. And so that was that time. And then there was another little boy that stayed in. He had a headache, and so I didn't make him go out to recess. And he had a headache, so I went over and started massaging his temples. And what he really wanted was to be touched and to be able to talk to somebody. So he started talking to me. And in some of the places I've taught are in low income districts where kids really needed to be touched. but I didn't really realize or think very much about doing that until a principal I had told me, he said, you realize sometimes you get parents choose you because you've got the reputation for seeing the gifts in their children. And it wasn't until that was articulated that I realized that I was doing that. And it was because of my daughter's death.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
That opened something up.
yeah. Wow, that's
So those are the breadcrumbs,
yeah.
that went without me recognizing it until somebody told me that.
So breadcrumbs can show up as just gentle prompts. One time I was driving home late at night. I used to be a Discovery Toys person, and I did home gatherings and taught parents
I know that.
early childhood development stuff. That I just loved working with families to help them, especially families with kids that were really struggling with traditional academics, to give them more the Montessori type. So I mean, it ignited something really profound in me to step into that role for a while. And I was driving home late one night, and I got this big hit, said, slow down. And it was like, everybody's going 70. Come on, I'm tired. I want to get home. And it was like, no, slow down. And so I slowed way down, and a truck about quarter mile ahead of me jackknifed. And if I'd been going any faster, I would not have cleared it. And so that was one of those little breadcrumbs, little moments of, oh, I am in connection with something here. Kind of like your recognition about the plants, Lee, and starting to see that there's an orchestration that I'm not really clear on yet, but there are moments where we get those little prompts, those little go up and rub his temples and touch him in a way that he's not getting at home. Those moments where we step outside of our own conventions to show up in a different way with people, and it's met with just grace, such a beautiful recognition that I'm doing exactly what I should be doing. This breadcrumbs to the soul happen all around us every day if we're present to them. And so I started a synchronicity journal years ago, keeping track of those things, because about those times you get kind of discouraged by what's happening all around you. I go back and I read those, and I think, that was really cool what happened. I couldn't have planned that. I didn't have the imagination to create that in the moment. It created itself, and I got to witness it. That's when you start to see that this path to consciousness is a real thing. It starts to have some balance between the concretized perception we have of the world and this energy, spiritual side perception we have of the world. That these moments of grace that show up along the way are, again, breadcrumbs to help us find our way home. Leveling up moments. These are big ones. These are when you go through your own death and rebirth on some aspect of the ego, and you're coming out to the other side, and you can look back and you can go, oh, no wonder that had to happen the way it did. No wonder that happened. Oh, no wonder I couldn't get along with that person. No wonder. I'll share one. I met this very charismatic couple, and we became instant friends, and our lives merged very quickly. And I've since learned that lack of boundaries is probably a danger point for me. And so I see it now through that lens. But at the time, I just thought these were the coolest humans on the planet. We were going to be best friends. And we spent tons of waking time together. And we were in medicine space together, which takes a lot of the typical cautionary boundaries down to a level of sort of soul to soul connection. And so it was deep. And there was a lot of what I would call conscious intimacy, but there was also a lot of unconscious intimacy. There were places where we were over serving ourselves into each other's world. And there ended up being just this whole shitload of drama when the relationship came apart, and it filtered out into many other relationships that were shared between us. And it created for me an unease with being in that community. And I stepped back and I felt very lonely and very sad for a long time. And I was in a place where I just wanted resolution. I'm one of those people that if we can work it out, I want closure. But after a while, closure just seemed impossible. So we didn't connect at all for almost 2 years. And then we happened to be at an ayahuasca sit together. And this is the time where the medicine works you. Whatever you're harboring against another human, whatever you're harboring against your own well-being, all of it shows up in that field with you. And so I'm in deep space with Mama, and I said, how do I make peace? He's across the room from me. Energetically, we're, not talking to each other, but we're in sacred space. How do you hold that? And she says, here's what you're going to say to him tomorrow. And I was like, oh, no way. That's not what I want to say. I want to say what happened and what are you willing to take responsibility for? I was clinging to the old way of getting it resolved, which meant I was just going to win my point, which was, the ego doing her best to hold on to who was right and who was wrong and all of it. And Mama said, these are the exact words you're going to say. And I was like, oh, okay, all right. How far down this rabbit hole of trust am I willing to go? But I guess I'm willing to go. And so I asked him if he would meet with me the next day, and he said yes. And up to that point, he had refused to have any conversation with me at all since the big blow up, the drama. And he asked if he could have his friends sit in, and I asked if it was okay if my husband sat in just to referee. I mean, this is how intense. This was like how kids get with each other. It was hard to grasp that this was an adult situation, and we were at that level of distrust with each other. And I said, okay, all right. So the witnesses, my husband and his friend, who's also my friend, and the two of us sat across from each other, this little, quad sitting there. And he sort of immediately was like, I'm not really comfortable with this, and I've got enough on my plate. I don't need anything else. And I said, well, could you just allow for the possibility that this is going to go very different than what you're expecting? Because Mama Aya gave me what exactly I need to say, and it's very different from what I was expecting. And he said, okay. And I said, I apologize for my wounding spilling into your world. And he looked at me and he said, you're right. I wasn't expecting that. And I said, me neither, but it's what's true. It's the only thing that I can claim as truth in this moment, that, you're doing the best you can, and I was doing the best I can, and my wounding was spilling into your world. And I just didn't have very good boundaries. And he said, yeah, I learned that lesson too. That was a big boundary teaching moment for me too. And I said, well, thank you for giving me that teaching moment. And he said, you're welcome. And that was it. 3 years of intensity and drama and story that I'd wrapped up in my head about who was right and who was wrong. And I just realized that every minute that I was in the drama mode with him, I was spilling my wounding into his story. And so I walked away from that.
Were you under the influence
No,
Had you had ayahuasca? Oh, you hadn't. Okay.
no influence here. This was me just straight up owning my part in the drama,
Yeah.
because that's all we can do, right? So that for me, that was a leveling up moment. I could look back and look at the benefit that had come from that chaos in my story to bring me to the place of recognizing that I was pretty unboundaried. In my instant intimacy with these two humans, and there was a lot of enmeshment. And when you become enmeshed with people who are also wounded, then there's also a lot of spillover. And so it was just a huge leveling up moment for me of gratitude. Like, oh my goodness, what was my greatest nemesis on the planet for the last 3 years now has become my greatest teacher. And so there are just those moments, those leveling up moments. And those words resonate for me. Anytime I have drama with somebody, it's because it is stirring my wounding and I'm spilling into their world. So those words come back to me. Oh, I'm sorry. Please accept my apology that my wounding spilled into your world. Now, do I think he should have come back and said that to me? Yeah, ego says I wish he had, but he didn't. He didn't, and that's okay. That's all right. He's doing the best he can. I'm doing the best I can, and this is me showing up as real and honest as I can in that leveling up moment. So these are the teaching moments where we become self-aware of our own portrayal in the drama of our lives. Like we do these things to ourselves by giving away so much power and so much of our truth to things outside of ourselves. So these leveling up moments are where you're claiming your truth back into the nest. Like you get to keep the lesson. You don't have to keep reliving it. You don't have to, you break the pattern, you own the truth, and you get ready to move into a next level of consciousness, your own path to consciousness. And then there are the clawbacks. Now these clawbacks are just when everything's going hunky, like hitting the top of your stride in your career. Things are like you're getting the recognition, you're getting all the things that you ever thought you wanted, and something pulls you back. There's almost a sabotaging effect, a self-betrayal in that clawback, where you realize you were performing as I think Stephen and Covey talk about, you're climbing the ladder, but are you on the right wall? Is the ladder on the correct wall? And so I was climbing the ladder and I was right at the top and I was sitting up there, and there was just this quicksand sensation in my body that, oh, this was an interesting skill development diversion, but this is not the path. This is not where I belong. And so I walked away from a 30-year career and a very comfortable lifestyle. And, it was a big clawback to bring me back to my path, not to get distracted by the status and the identity and the success. It's these clawbacks are moments where the soul says, you lost track of things. I'm going to bring you back down, because you're here to solve for X, and that is for you to fall in love with this life. And that thing you're doing is a coping strategy. That thing you're doing is an adaptation to a level of normal that isn't true for you anymore. Like they're just moments where you have to own your own truth. And there's clawbacks that come with that recognition. Synchronicities, rule of 3. Somebody will mention a book to me, and I go, oh, that's interesting. Then it kind of, a little tick happens because it's somebody I trust and admire. And then it shows up on a podcast, and I go, oh, okay, that's interesting. I'm hearing more about it. And then usually by the third round, it's like a done deal. I'm supposed to read this book. And then I pick it up and I realize, oh, yeah, I know why I'm supposed to read this book. It unfolds a whole piece of the inquiry that I'm in the middle of, right? synchronicities about people, synchronicities about directions, synchronicities about options. You know, my daughter wanted to do some specialized yoga training in Bali, and it just, other things were pulling her in other directions, and the synchronicities lined up that she really needed to be here right now. And so, you know, sometimes those setbacks that we feel in our trajectory are really to get us to slow down and stay present to something that's right here in the field around us. Can you relate to some synchronicities? Those are pretty well known out there. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just like you. If something happens 3 times, I know, or the message I get, sometimes it's just a message.
Yeah.
I remember, I'm thinking of one recently where the message was, stay out of it, stay out of it, stay out of it. I stayed out of it, resolved it. So sometimes it's just a message, but just like you, the 3rd time that's a done deal.
It's a done deal. You don't second guess yourself. Your bio navigation system has given you 3 turn signals, right? It says, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, listen, 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 notice, notice, notice. And when you start to trust that, then all of a sudden you land in a place where you go, okay, where's the next synchronicity? So you become like, you open up your reticular activating system, the part of the brain that is constantly filtering out all that isn't important for those heightened awareness moments that come up for us. Lee, can you relate to synchronicities and 3s?
Yeah, I can relate to synchronicities. Yeah, just things will happen where it's like, for example, like with my diet, well, I was being told to look at reducing sugar and alcohol and caffeine for my bladder. And then I was like, Jill sent me a thing about a diet that included many of the same things, but it was a way of eating for helping with stabilizing mood, right? And I got, I don't remember what it was, but there was another message to me for something unrelated that was, you know, I needed to reduce caffeine, alcohol, and sugar. And it was several different diets for different things. But as I've been doing that, my body's a lot happier.
Yeah. So that's, your point is really, there are threads. So something will come into the field, and it, maybe not the whole thing, but a piece of it then shows up in something else, and it's kind of like you're connecting the dots. You're trusting that there is some wisdom that you're tracking. You know, there's a beautiful song that we sing in ceremony a lot, and I'll sing it not well, but you'll get it. You don't have to know the way knows the way. You don't have to plan the way, trust the way, feel your way, the way knows, the way knows, the way knows, the way. The way knows the way. And this bio navigation system that we're, you know, coming online, our inner GPS is starting to sync up to our awareness in a way that I believe is part of the evolutionary shift of consciousness, that we find the consciousness of choice within our own bodies to know what is the next right step to take. is part of our divine physicality to experience, right? So synchronicities are, we even talked about maybe doing something with a website where we just have people line up their synchronicities, just put them in posts. Wouldn't it be fun just to read about all? I had one just a few months ago where I was driving to town and I had some errands to run. And I went to this place up on the hill that I'd never been before. And when I came back down the hill, I took the wrong turn and I end up going the opposite direction on this funky little sort of turnabout we have in town. And I thought, well, all right, why am I going up? I thought I was going home. Why am I here? And I pulled the car over and I just sat there for 2 minutes. And I got a text from my friend who lives at the next stop sign and up. And he says, hey, are you in town? I'd love to see you. I've got something for you. And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, the car knew to bring me to this moment. And I like those sorts of things happen a lot. And rather than getting frustrated, like, why am I stuck in traffic for 20 minutes? And then the phone rings and it gives me 20 minutes to connect with one of my kids about something that's important. Like, I take every moment now as, you know, a potential synchronicity. I'm just always curious about when my plans don't quite go the way I think they're going to go, that their way has the way. My planning is often just ego folly to get me to some sense of comfort about the direction I'm going. But really at this point, it's all about trust, right? So ego death, whoo, that is a big trust moment in this path to consciousness, that saying to somebody who I really wanted to make wrong and even still could find reasons why there was more fault on his side than mine. But you know what? I wanted to release myself from the story. I wanted to release myself from the drama. And so there's a little bit of an ego death in just showing up with, please forgive me, my wounding spilled into your world. Thank you for the lesson on boundaries. And so that's a gentle ego death. There are times when the universe serves up even bigger ego deaths, like a job setback. I think about how many people have struggled through COVID with, you know, their whole sense of identity of who they are, what's important. Other people have taken COVID and been able to reevaluate what they want for their lives and let go of the old story. And, you know, people are living on the road, working from anywhere. They're not tied to high expensive housing areas. They can move. I mean, sometimes the ego death of our old story, our attachment to a certain way of being, a certain way of appearing in the world, always opens up an opportunity for something that's much more in line with our highest selves. But we cling so mightily to that old story that it's oftentimes where the dark night of the soul, that passage, becomes such a present part of our awareness. It's a midlife crisis moment. It's where we just can't keep doing what we've done in the past, but we don't yet trust what's coming for us in the future. And so we act out and buy cars and have affairs and fall apart and have breakdowns, when really, if we could just honor that every one of us deserves the opportunity for a reset in their lives, to move into some new sense of who they are. That sadly, we have this construct that says that we have to keep performing at this high level. And when people stop performing at that high level, they get judged for it. They get, you know, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you playing the game with the rest of us anymore? And this is a rite of passage to have an ego death, to let go of the old story, our attachment to being right, our attachment to being the best at anything, the attachment to our survival strategies, many of which do not serve us, the coping skills that create addiction, that create rage, and you know, even letting go of those is hard. There's an ego death in letting go of any of that old story. And it's an interrupt, it's a pattern interrupt to the way that we process the world around us. And so it demands a level of comfort with the ambiguity of not knowing who you are yet to become, but also recognizing you don't want to stay where you are. And that bardo, that middle ground is big work. And if we talked about it as a natural part of your evolution, not something to be shamed, but something to be really honored in our human story, that couples could navigate it with trust rather than seeing it as an affront to the relationship. I mean, there's just a whole other way of seeing these interruptions in our story as gifts rather than obstacles. Trauma imprint. Now, just imagine you're sort of, if you do your timeline, that you might put some of these little letters next to places on your map. And for me, my trauma imprint started very early. It was reinforced in 3 or 4 different situations in my life, such that it became pretty hard inked into my soma. And this trauma imprinting becomes our woundology. We don't just have the wound, we have the story of what happened around that wounding, and that becomes a big part of our personality. Our whole lens of perception is influenced by that woundology, and so this imprinting is deep, and it can be exhausting to maintain it, but the fear of changing oftentimes is not strong enough until we're forced to let go of an old story. In other words, we will cling to our attachment of who we were until sometimes the choice is off the table. For me, the pulmonary embolism took that choice off the table for me to stay and do what I've been doing before. It was a major pattern interrupt. It was a major trauma excitation in my story. And so there was I just didn't have a choice to keep doing things the way I was doing, to be running the candle at both ends and traveling all over the country and doing what I was doing as a speaker. It was killing me. And the stress with my ex-husband, the drama there, it was killing me, literally killing me. So I had to deal with the trauma. I had to let go of the drama and stop. I remember coming out of that experience, and even my ex-husband saying, "You're different. You're not fighting with me." And I said, "I don't have it in me anymore. I don't have any more fight. I want to live. I don't want to be fighting the rest of my days." So trauma imprinting is, somewhere in our story. Lee, details aren't important, but I know you can relate to what I'm talking to here, this trauma imprint.
Oh yeah, when it's, you get into, or for me, it gets me into a pattern of defense. And that's, when I look back on it, I'm defending against my old traumatic experience, and it's affecting my perception of that current experience,
Right.
In a way that is making it more dramatic and continuing on.
Yes. It exacerbates the drama in everything around you. Yeah.
And keeps you in it.
Yes.
It's also an attachment to it, I think.
Yeah. That woundology becomes part of our entire persona. So moving out of that attachment is big work, right? Karen, can you relate to a trauma imprint in your story or witness it in somebody else?
I would call it more a wounding that at the time I remember it, but and it has influenced me. And that was when I was young. We didn't have a lot of money, but I didn't think that we didn't have money. And
Mm.
our first house that we lived in, we had an outhouse because we didn't have a bathroom. And then we finally moved into the city, and there was a bathroom, but it was also behind the Oldsmobile factory. And we were sandwiched in between this convenience store and a abandoned house. And so, so you can imagine the neighborhood. So a convenience store next door was the typical, old store where there's somebody there and you can see where everything is. And it was rat infested, and my dad did not want us shopping at the store. And one time my dad asked me to go there and get some bread. And I was afraid of the old man who was there, and he wasn't nice. And so I was upset when I couldn't count out, I'm 5, so I was upset when I couldn't count out the change for a loaf of bread. And so I was always a little afraid of him. But the man didn't like me. He was nice not nice, but tolerable at the moment because I had money to buy a loaf of bread. And then the next time I went into the store, I went with some of the neighbor kids who had money to buy candy, but I didn't have any money to buy candy. And so when he saw me come in, I know what happened. My dad went back and yelled at him for me being upset when I came back about the loaf of bread. So when I came back in with those kids, he said, what is she doing in here? And everybody's looking, and he said, get her out of here. I don't want that trash in here. And he was referring to me. And I had no money, so I was standing back while my friends bought their candy. And that wounding made me feel I think when I say made me feel, I carried it with me as not being good enough.
Right.
And so that's where the wounding is. And then here's another thought I have about those kinds of things. As long as they're not horrible traumas, like sexual abuse or being beaten or those kinds of stuff, but that kind of experience, then when you think about it as an adult, definitely was a wounding.
Right.
But then when we bring our adult thinking, we make it even worse. And because we have an adult perception of it than that. Now, I don't believe I shared that with my dad, because my dad was the protective one. And I would be sent on the errands because my mother would refuse to. And so I'm thinking that a lot of my carrying that is with an adult's perception of, what a fucker of a store clerk he is to be talking to kids like that. What a horrible thing. And even making it be a huge thing, instead of it was definitely a wounded thing. But so what do you think about that? Because sometimes there's little things that as adults we can look back at and we make into bigger things.
Or maybe it was an adult. Here's the term normalizing keeps coming to my awareness in this moment, that as adults we tend to normalize what happened to us as children. We think, it wasn't that bad, it wasn't that big a deal, but for little Karen to have shame, be publicly shamed by this man, that's a major hit to a little kid's psyche. And so it may seem like an incidental thing, and this is where sometimes cognitive therapy does not always serve us completely. There's what happened, and then there's how we reacted to what happened. And depending upon who you were when you walked into the store that day, you could have just let that roll off your back, or maybe that was the straw that broke the camel's back of shame, that it has now, I'm not saying this is your truth, Karen, but sometimes I let the child have the voice in the telling of
Yeah.
that story, because that's where the imprint lies, is in their level of consciousness, their level of awareness and perception of what's happening in the world around them. So these trauma imprints tend to sort of alter our view. They cloud our perception of what's really happening in the world around us. We become a little bit hypervigilant. We become maybe a little paranoid. We don't trust. One of the things, Lee, you've shared with me is you just didn't believe that people did nice things for each other.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean,
There's a learned
I saw them as
skepticism.
exchanges,
Yeah.
and if somebody did do something nice, then you owed them.
Right. Everything was transactional, right? So there was no grace in your story, no love because you're lovable. Just, it was all transactional. So that, when I do timeline work with people, that would stand out for me, and I'd say, where is that story repeating itself in your timeline, over where you can't accept or trust? And so that's, these trauma imprints can be very insidious. They may seem like a very small thing that happened, but they, you often hear people talk about it in these terms, like, it was such a little thing, but I lost my shit. I just came unglued. It was such an out of proportion response to what was actually happening in the moment. And whenever I hear that Mount Vesuvius volcanic storyline, like, I erupted, like something, it's when that trauma imprint is triggered. Like, you now have years and years and years of holding it together, and then one thing hits you and you lose your shit. And so these moments where that imprint has grabbed a hold of our well-being in a way that is not serving us, is to be paid attention to in our timeline. Like, mine was boundary violations, instant friendships, instant trust. I gave everybody the benefit of the doubt rather than holding boundaries about myself. I would betray myself right and left, allowing my own wisdom to be overridden by, I didn't want to hurt people's feelings. Like, oh, these people are not really good people, but I didn't want to hurt their feelings. So you go along to get along, right? There's so many ways that trauma plays out in our story that it becomes unconscious. It's just such an automated response to everything, reaction to everything that's happening around us. And by beginning to map our timeline with some real language around what these things are and how they behave in the human experience, we begin to take the power out of them. We begin to dissect them as components of our wounding, not actual truths or behaviors that we have to hang on to anymore. Rest areas. I had one dear woman, I was at a weekend workshop, personal development stuff, and we were sharing some of our story, and she looked at me and she said, "Oh, sweetheart, you need some gentle rain in your life." And I said, "What does that mean?" And she goes, you need a rest area. You've been running on this treadmill for so long to try and make life make sense. You need rest. And I took her words, and they just, one of those breadcrumbs to my soul thing, and it just hung with me. And I kept hearing in my own backstory, you need rest. You've just been running at this for so long, that I actually started asking for sabbaticals like 10 years ago. Like, I think I need 3 months away from the old story, the work that I was doing. And everybody would laugh at me because I was working with accountants, and that fell naturally during tax season. But it was more than that. It was a statement to myself about claiming back some stillness in my story. And so these rest areas became real sort of lily pads of softness for me in my life. And I began to really look for the rest area. How do I create more spaciousness around my schedule so that I can have more of this downtime. The idea of downtime, I felt guilty. It felt unproductive. I wasn't measuring up to the task of being beyond reproach, which was my coping strategy for the human experience. So rest areas, where did you create them? Where did they get handed to you? Through illness, through coronaviruses, through ruptured Achilles. Like I can look at how I managed to figure out how to sit still for 2 years, not because I planned it, but because my body demanded it, right? So pay attention. Valleys of despair. Yeah, there have been a few of those. I can imagine, Karen, after losing your child, there was a big valley of despair, a moment where you just question the whole story of why are we here to, what does this?
Exactly, or I didn't want to be here.
Yeah.
I do have a question that I've often thought about, but I really haven't asked, if you don't mind me taking up some space here, Lee. And that is, when I think of my childhood, I think of happiness because I had a nice, my mother's side of the family, extended family, oh, lovely, a farm. That's where I get my love of nature. But I don't have a lot of memories of my mother. And my mother was mentally ill. She's no longer alive. She was mentally ill. And she had OCD and paranoia. And when she'd get upset, she was loud, and you just had to get out of the way because you could never calm her down. And she would keep it forever and ever. But it's interesting that she's like that. But when I think of, like, when I'm talking about my dad sending me to get the bread, it was my brother wasn't feeling well, and the store was right next door, and he needed to make us sandwiches, and my mother was done for the night. She just wasn't going to do anything, but my dad worked all day long. But I don't remember my mother. Like in the house with the outhouse, I remember running around with my sister, 17 months younger than, naked and laughing and giggling. And as an adult, I asked my mom, why don't I remember Penny and I running around the house naked? She says, it's because you went out to the outhouse to go to the bathroom, and then your dad put you both into the kitchen sink to give you your bath, and you just had a lot of fun. She didn't say you had a lot of fun, just because you had to go to the bathroom and your dad gave you a bath. So my dad did all the parenting. And I always felt protected around my dad. I felt safe around my dad. But my mother, here's all this going on, and she's like not in my memory at all. And she's there though, but I just don't remember. And I don't remember much about her except odd moments here and there where she was in my life until I was about 11, when there was a situation with some of the neighborhood girls, one in particular, who was hurting the feelings of other neighborhood girls. So one of the mothers, that other neighborhood girl, came out and chewed me out, but it was her daughter that was a problem. So I asked for a meeting of the girls involved and our mothers. My mother didn't open her mouth once. And it was the neighborhood girl's mother, the neighborhood girl who was the antagonist's mother, who listened to it all and said, I'm not going to call my daughter a liar, but I don't know you to be one either. So I'm staying out of whatever happens in the future. What a wise woman. But yeah. I remember leaving that meeting thinking, I'm on my own. I guess I've always been on my own, except for my dad. And I'm on my own because she wasn't able. She just wasn't able.
Yeah.
But her presence was. But my memory, when I think of all those fun times, had a great childhood with cousins and extended family and all that. Always had dinner on the table. We never went hungry. Clean clothes, all that kind of stuff. Nothing like that. We weren't beaten or even slapped. So there was no physical punishment. And but I don't remember much of her presence at all, even though she was there. So, you know, that's always baffled me. Why I'm talking about my having fun with my sister when I'm 4, but I don't remember my mother's presence.
Can I ask you to kind of just close your eyes and sit with what that feels like not to have felt engaged with your mother?
You know, here's the other thing. I don't feel anything about her. And because I didn't know what it was like to have a mother, even when she lived until she was 91, and guess who was the one who ended up, who she moved by and to take care of her. And I was the least patient one with her when I was a teenager. That's when I do remember her, because she was always on my case as a teenager, but before 11, I do not. And I was the least patient, but by the time she started really getting feeble, I knew that, you know, she just wasn't capable. And so I became patient, and she noticed it and said something to me about appreciating my patience. First time that I ever remember that. And I was the one who cared for her, even though she was in an assisted care place. Until she died, I made sure I was always available, going to see her, because I had a sense of, you take care of people, because my dad always did. But I have no feelings of love for her whatsoever. I don't hate her.
It's just a neutral event for you.
Yeah, she's just this person who was mentally ill, and so she couldn't help it. So right now I'm feeling I don't have any blame about it. But I people say, don't you miss your mother? No. Well, how could you not miss somebody you love? And right. I hold back. Didn't love her. Didn't love her.
Okay.
So I've always wondered about that.
Yeah, I that's something that sounds like it's pretty settled in your belly until maybe it isn't one day. Maybe someday you'll get some other piece of that inquiry come forward as you unlock some other piece of your story, or you're at peace with it. You know, like there are just parts of the story that don't need more digging. They're okay as they are. You don't feel a negative impact. That's okay. That's good.
Yeah.
It was neutral.
Thank you. You're another person who said that to me, saying, I think you're at peace with it, Karen, because you did the right thing. You did what you felt you needed to do by caring for her at the end.
You know, if I go into the lens of why this for that, like I believe in soul contracts, and these are primary contracts, our parents, our children, our siblings, people who are intimate caregivers with us. There's always some lesson, some value proposition between us, and you know, it may be that her inability to meet you because of her mental illness, to engage with you, it created an awareness of you to be patient with people with mental illness. Like you developed a softness for that space. You said it 2 or 3 different ways in your explanation, but you know, like I had nothing I could hold against her because she was mentally ill. You from the very moment you first described her, you knew that, you know, she could not be a conscious participant in your life. Yeah.
Maybe that contributed with my teaching in accepting the different personalities and that kind of thing, or outrageous behavior in the low-income districts, to more than tolerate it, but accept it.
Yeah, you have a big umbrella for compassion for people and how they're able to show up. So I have a very tender situation with one of my daughters. I have four kids, 3 girls and a boy, and one of them I just have a really hard relationship with. It's one that started early on when she really had a challenge with my dad, and I was still normalizing his behavior, and she set boundaries, and I punished her for setting boundaries, and was not even aware of how I had made her feel for holding her boundaries, but it created a huge rift between us. And years later, when I finally made the choice to separate myself from my dad, to not normalize it anymore, to allow myself to feel what it was really doing to me, I let my daughter know that I had withdrawn my engagement from that relationship. And I thanked her for always holding a boundary around that. And before I understood what and so we were able to unpack all of the reason why we had this rift between us. And I said, now in the hope of hopes, I can say to you, thank you for teaching me boundaries. And I'm wondering if there's some benefit that you can harvest from this challenge, this conflict, this soul contract that we've had with each other. And she very graciously said, I learned to be very self-sufficient. I ended up marrying a guy, moving across the country and having to figure it out all by myself. There was not a dependency on anybody, especially you, Mom, because of what had happened. And I think I'm a stronger woman because of it. And so that's what you hope for, that where you've had conflict with somebody, where the soul contract is one of challenger and not necessarily ally. And so there's that grist for the mill of growth that, if we really evolve to a highly conscious state of being, we can sit down with each other and own our stuff and thank each other for the lesson, right? To really harvest the lesson. So, if I just look at all of these terms, I've had so many of these along the way, but the biggest ones have been those soul contract closure moments where you look at somebody and you go, I know exactly why you're in my life. I know exactly what I came to learn from you. And they look at you and go, yeah, I get it. I get exactly. Like Lee and I are in this beautiful soul contract. And we danced. She was my brother's and my son's girlfriend for a long time and stayed connected with the family. And we never lost
This Lee?
This Lee.
This Lee?
This
Oh,
Lee.
you guys do. You have a relationship from before. How sweet.
We have a soul contract to our stories have very similar threads of betrayal early on and wounding, and some of her physical symptomology is very similar to my own. And so I have kind of a mother's affection for Lee as a daughter, but also just as a fellow beautiful woman working her way through life. And I think that Lee and I have been in each other's lives for what we're doing right now, because she's really good at unpacking this healing conversation. I think she's somebody who's going to be able to take this into her life and expand it in ways that I don't even know yet. I just trust that, those moments, I don't even have it on my legend here, but, I know what I'm talking about. Those moments where you level up with another human, you look at each other and go, I so get why you're in my life. Thank you. Even if they come in as a challenger.
Sweet. That's so sweet.
It is sweet, and here we are.
Yes.
She's Lee's a big part of my world. Love her to pieces, and she's helping me figure out how to bridge this information to the millennials and the wires like this who have kind of divorced themselves of the bigger picture. They're all in survival mode right now, and so Lee's a part of that. So let me finish this legend so that we can sort of stay on track tonight, although this is
okay. Sorry.
No, this is all about trust. That
this just feels so intimate. This feels so intimate. So
yes, it is, and hopefully lots of other people can step into it with us and relate. So valleys of despair, mountains of meanings, those moments where you're doing something that is so big and scary, but you also trust. For me, doing the healing conversation is my mountain of meeting, and I take it one day at a time, one step at a time. But I really do feel like this brings meaning to my life to have these conversations, to give some succor and comfort to everyone who's going through this challenging this legendary map of consciousness. Slingshot movements. Whoa, these are when you feel like you've been just treading water for the longest time, like you just in a state of constancy, not even trying to be patient, because patient has an expectation of an outcome. I'm trying to stay present in the moment, and you think you're exhausted because you got to have something's got to shift. Something's got, like somewhere between Zen and insanity is this tension of trust and how much longer, like this.
Yeah.
I remember, giving birth, like, I trusted my body knows to do this, but I'd look at the midwife and go, what are we talking here? How many more hours? Like we need some help with the timeline here. And she'd look at me and go, you're only 3 centimeters. You got time, right? Like, oh, so we had some benchmarks along the way, but and then all of a sudden you go from 3 centimeters to 10 centimeters in 45 minutes. And this is where the slingshot just pulls you back, and you are just thrust into a portal of shift, like something so big and profound happens. My pulmonary embolism was a slingshot moment. It pulled me way back, but coming out of it, my whole pursuit of truth shifted. My whole nervous system begged for more rest. It begged for more inquiry about the healing of my body, that my body had become so assaulted through stress that I had this blood clot and a pulmonary embolism. I mean, doctor says you got a whole bunch of stuff that didn't line up right, including a genetic predisposition to clotting, but being on birth control pills and the stress of my life, and it just pulled me back, kicked my ass, but then it just flung me forward. There are slingshot movements happening very quickly right now as we are accelerating this pace of shift. The collapse is happening very noticeably, transparently around us right now, and at the same time, this rise in light and access to higher states of consciousness are happening in concert with each other. And so that energy, that gyrational torque creates these slingshot moments, like where you lose your job, you lose your apartment, you buy a van, you discover that you love traveling all over the country, and you start doing, gig work, and you all of a sudden, where you were freaked out a year ago. I have several friends that have taken this path in the last year, and they are happier than they've ever been. The old treadmill died, and now they're in a completely different walk on this earth. So slingshot movements are happening very quickly around us. I'm kind of in the middle of one right now, which I won't talk about until and if it comes through. I'm trying hard not to attach, but there is support showing up for the healing conversation in a way that I've sort of been anticipating without attaching, but it feels like this is one of those trajectory moments. So slingshot movements, explicit consent, innocence reclaimed. This is that movement where I talk a lot about, life begins and ends with breath, and it's the intention that we breathe each breath in between that creates the heaven or hell of our existence. And so breath as the, sort of ticket to entry, and what you leave behind when you leave this physical world, that's an implied consent. You're here to breathe into a physical body, to engage in a physical world. That's part of the contract that gave you the yes to be here. But then there is an explicit age of consent, a moment where we show up in trust, where we are exactly what we need to be in this moment in time, and that although we are not in any state of perfection, we are in a state of progress towards our soul, towards our highest state of consciousness. And so this age of consent, this full-bodied consent to the human experience, is something that has been sort of an evolving thing for me over the last couple of years, but there's such clarity now about how my wounding was getting in the way of trusting that yes to the human experience. There was always this reserved vigilance, this not quite trusting at all sense of my expression in the world, like always second guessing, always letting that imposter syndrome or that self-doubt sort of have the bigger voice at the table. And I think it's important to allow your humility and some self-doubt to creep in, because it keeps us humble. But when you have a lot of structural damage from wounding, like the brain doesn't even quite sit straight on its central nervous system, you end up, not trusting consent, not even trusting loving yourself. Because that's really what consent is to fall head over heels in love with who you are. It's to trust that you are a divine co-creator of this experience, and that you are here to fully express, like to go all in on being you, to hold your fullness, your light, your expression with sacred witnessing, to just let it be. And so this explicit consent is that moment where we reclaim our innocence, where the wounding no longer has sway in the story. It is sometimes it's like degrees, and then all of a sudden you get a big yes, I'm ready to be here. And honestly, me sort of launching the healing conversation was the beginnings of that yes. And I'm deep in this complete age of consent to surrender. And even that's a doctrine of dominion word, to just accept the wholeness of who I am and help others do the same. Can you relate to any of that I'm talking about? These consent moments, these slingshot movements, like where does that resonate for you, Karen or Lee?
I would say that for me, it's like a relaxation. It's like I can exhale.
Yes.
And it's like, I can exhale. It is what it is, and it is beautiful. That kind of a thought.
Yes. No more resistance to the human experience, right? Just accept it.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. There is an ease in your beingness. How about for you, Lee?
For me, it's more literal. It's more, am I going to continue to consent to living life? Or am I going to have the idea in the back that I could stop this journey whenever I choose? And
And what would happen if both of those were true?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, I can see how both of those can be true. And I can see how by consenting to live, I am consenting to engage with and go through whatever is ahead.
Yeah.
Rather than attaching to the idea that there needs to be a way out.
Yeah.
The way out will be whatever the way out is.
Right. In the meantime, you get to live. Like there's this sort of there's Alan Watts would say, you have to die before you can truly live. Like you have to be willing to surrender to our mortality. Like, I don't know how much time I have left on this. Why am I wasting it? Second guessing my existence and the full expression of that existence. Why am I wasting? I think I talked about this in the last session, this idea that we are not here to waste a single breath. We're not here to waste. And waste, of course, has a doctrine of dominion connotation to it as well. But I think in terms of soul, not wasting a minute of soul, not wasting a minute of experience, not wasting a minute of our light in suffering. I mean, life is going to serve up its own dose of loss through the physical expression that we've accepted in our implied consent, like illness and tragedy and death and dying and illness and suffering. All of that's baked into the physical story. And we'll get better at managing that as we get smarter about what keeps us from being well. But aside from that, everything else is a choice. Everything else is a way of perceiving life. Everything else. And I remember how hard I resisted that notion, because that meant I couldn't blame, I couldn't shame other people for not showing up. Like, Karen, I really honor your big heart to have seen your mother through the lens of compassion as a very early maturity in your story that has served you your whole life. It's part of the kindness of your expression. Your mother gave you that gift, and you didn't circle around the woundology of it. You harvested the lesson early in your life. So these moments of our story where things can be interpreted as bad or awful or disgusting, or all of it is a lens of perception. And if you spend any time abroad, you realize that Americans have some very quirky judgments about things that people share bathrooms all over the world. They go to the bathroom in outhouses all over the world. We have so much bullshit associated with wealth and value and shame here in the United States that a little girl would be shamed for living in a situation where she didn't have any money for candy. I mean, that's the United States is pretty screwed up in its construct of acceptance. Like, we just have so many impediments to accepting life as it is, to accepting even death for what it is. We live our whole lives afraid of death. And we suffer because of it. We don't get to live a full life. So consenting to the human experience is saying, I want to be here, and I'm going to create a life that makes me want to be here every day. I'm going to follow the breadcrumbs to my soul, and I'm going to trust that when my body says no to something, that is truth. When my body says yes to something, that I have no reason to hold back, that I have all the permission I can grant to myself to have a full-bodied human experience. When I did my TED Talk, I blacked out. I learned something, Karen, you'll appreciate this, as an adult, that I have.
Did you really black out?
I mean, I didn't pass out, but I went blank.
Okay.
I went completely blank, because you're supposed to memorize your 14 minutes of TED Talk. And I realized I cannot memorize anything. I don't have that ability in my brain. It's a dyslexia thing. I didn't learn until I did my TED Talk, and a friend afterwards helped me unpack what had happened. It wasn't stage fright. I've been on a stage as a speaker for 30 years. I was very comfortable being on a stage. I had PowerPoints. I was good to go. But something about that expression that I was trying to organize for sharing about synchronicities and trusting the setbacks in your life, trusting that everything happens for a reason. It was such a big idea that I was just barely starting to embrace it myself, that when it was time to deliver it, I completely whited out. I could not put two of the words together that I'd been practicing for weeks and weeks. And the channel opened up and I delivered a TED Talk. And what was fascinating is I didn't get to watch it for like 30 days. It takes them that long to process all and get it all uploaded. And so a month after I had delivered, and by the way, this is a moment I should talk about. I delivered the TED Talk. I didn't remember anything I'd said. Stephen had arranged for us to go to a lovely spa up in Napa right after I finished. And we were there with these beautiful mineral pools, and I couldn't leave the room for 3 days. I went into a shame hangover, a clawback. I was like, oh, you don't even know what you said. Words came through you. You didn't control. This could be the end of who you don't even know. You let that channel rip open in front of everyone. And I went into this huge shame clawback, literally for 3 days, just in such grief. I cried. Stephen kept leaving the room to go get food and to go do his massages, but I'd leave me here. I mean, I really went fetal. And it was because it's the closest I'd ever come to letting my true self be shown. It was the most true moment of 30 years of being on stage teaching something. This was full raw exposure of who I was showing up on that stage. And I went through this incredible 3-day, in the mountain retraction. And I recorded everything I was feeling. And it was like my shame core, my imposter syndrome. Who do you think you are? All the ways the ego breaks us down when we try and step into our light, when we trust something that doesn't make sense to the world, doesn't make sense to the storyline that we've been living. And it was a big moment of consent to holding this truth about myself that didn't come easily. And it took me that was 4 years ago, 5 years ago. It took me another couple of years to begin to really trust that. So I share all this with you because you're going to begin to notice in your timeline, which I'll share before we finish today, mine, just to get a sense of what a timeline looks like. But somewhere along my timeline, I can place all of these little legendary monikers to be able to say, oh, there is some structural reset happening. That soul transactions piece, Lee and I are in the middle of a soul transaction. Karen and I have had a soul transaction, like those we're here to show up and witness each other, to really just be here to walk each other home. That sweetness, and I'm present to it every day. And the soul retrieval piece is where you go and you collect the 3-year-old, the 8-year-old, the 12-year-old, all the pieces of yourself that you leave behind. And I've shared this in other sessions, so I'm not speaking out of turn here. It took a gift of ketamine to help me with the structural reset, to help me orient my brain back to a normal GPS setting. It's like my compass had been askew. I couldn't quite trust my inner navigation system because there was always this filter of fear between what I was seeing and what I was feeling. Can you relate to what I'm talking about here? It's a big idea what I'm talking about, that when you've had a trauma and a deep trauma imprint, something that has sort of become part of your personality for so long that you can't quite trust your own compass, your own bionavigation system, because it's edged by fear, it's edged by cortisol, it's edged by mistrust of the human experience. And so ketamine for me was the tool that helped reorient me back to, oh, of course that's who you are. Of course, no second guessing, no second, no self-doubt, just trusting you are exactly enough. And so I would say that consenting to the human experience is something that comes in layers and layers and layers as a cognitive exercise, but sometimes the final consent can only be met at a wordless level in our own bodies. Like I want to be here now. I want to be here to have these conversations with humans all over the planet. I want to, this is what my life is. I'm finally stepping into all of the gifts of my story. And so you reach a tipping point, and here's, I'm going to share with you my map. This is what it looks like when you do a timeline of your story, right? So starting with born in 1958, and I'm not going to go through the detail here. That's on the recording I did for Wave Street, but there were some major trajectory shifting moments, leaving the church, leaving a marriage, filing for bankruptcy, having to start over, not having a college degree. I mean, I had some really interesting twists and turns that brought me to where I am now. But if I overlay this map of consciousness on top of that, I begin to see the thread of my story. I begin to see the golden tapestry of my story and how I get to pull on that. And it's no longer wound throughout the weaving. It is the wisdom of my story that I get to claim now for having done this timeline. And we talk so much about our mental illness and our pathology, and we get over diagnosed about what's happening, and depression. To me, depression is just the dissonance between our inner truth and our outward acceptance of what's happening for us in this lifetime. Like depression, the word itself is appropriate. We are depressing our own light. We're depressing our expansion in the human story. And so every day that we feel depressed, it's because the construct around us has created a story that we don't feel we can expand into. So depression and anxiety and so much of the pathology that we're being medicated for now, really, if we were to step back from this picture and realize that it's not pathology, it's just that we don't understand the path to consciousness. It's going to have setbacks, it's going to have valleys of despair, it's going to have dark nights of the soul, it's going to have trials and tribulations, it's all of it. If we could apply the lens of love, not the lens of fear, like why did this happen to me, instead of what is the lesson I get to harvest from my story? What is the gift in the process that, to have a complete leveling up of your story, like means you would look at your life and say, I wouldn't change a thing. Because the things I still want to change, I'm now in charge of. I'm not a victim to them. This is part of my growth. What's left on the plate for me to work on is the things I choose to work on. Does that make sense, Lee? I see you smiling. Where does that land for you?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about getting to a place where you're living with your whole self and engaging with yourself.
Yes. And you'll have days where you'll have to have stern conversations with yourself. and days where you get to just delight in being you. Like that ease of beingness is my target condition now. It's where do I find the ease in the chaos around me? And it's when I am in complete trust that I am exactly who I need to be in this moment to be here, right? The calculus of you, all the inputs to your story, all the twists and turns, all the synchronicities, all the breadcrumbs, all the pivot points, all the rest areas, all the meaning, and all of the despair, all of it is the meal that you get to serve up to yourself in awareness now. That it is trusting that you are exactly who you are in this moment and living into that fullness, that pure potentiality. There is no passion to be found in settling for a life that is less than the one you are capable of living. Passion arises in us when we find that alignment where we are lit up, like, you know, Edie and Edie. Practical, get it done, manifest in the world, make love in a physical world, shows up with higher self, wise, kind, loving, compassionate, heals the physical expansion of love in this world. Like, you get to be your own fountain of love. You get to be your own source generator of love. You don't have to reach for it outside of yourself anymore. You just have it. And on the days you struggle to find it, it just means stillness. It just means to sit quietly, to give yourself a rest area that you've gotten distracted by the chaos around you. It can never be taken away from us. Do you remember the first night I went back and watched it? And everybody was kind of giggling a little bit when I was teasing about, you know, like, this, what else would I be doing in this moment? You know, like, people were saying, thank you for doing this. It's like, no, this is what I want to be doing. This is like, I have passion for this. I'm excited about this. You don't even have to pay me for this. I just want to do this. Like, I just want to be here, you know, and I just trust that this is, when you are living in alignment within yourself, nobody can take that away from you. And you move from being reactionary in a very chaotic world to consciously responding, to showing up ready to solve for X, right? So I'm just going to zoom through this and then we'll come to some closure here. So when I do the work of timelines with people in private, we would go through and I'd have them do this in advance of our gathering and then take me through and highlight some of the big pivot points, some of the recurring themes. And what starts to show up is, in this moment, they're in their crisis of soul. This is that, we call it our midlife crisis. We call it a breakdown, you know, whatever it is. In that moment, they've shown up ready to do their work. They're not only ready, but they're willing and they're able to do the work because we've got some support around them to get it done. And so this crisis is this piece that we're in right now collectively, is this crisis of soul. This is, we have to go through this. Anything that we individually have to go through, you will see manifested across the globe. This is just the process of birthing a new consciousness, individually and collectively. When I work with people, I will do for them what I did for myself, which is, you know, what are the repeating themes? There were boundary violations. There was food and body shaming. There was a lot of codependency. There was a lot of attachment to certainty. Like, I pursued 35 years of religious certainty because I thought that that would keep me safe. Then I realized that sourcing my well-being from outside of me went against my own intuitive knowing that I had to find it in here. And there was a theme of terror, just pure panic in physical form. I did not ever feel safe in my body. And so from a woundology perspective, that is that life happened to me. These are the messages. This is the trauma imprint that hung around for a very long time. My body is not my own. It's not safe. My body is not good enough. Food is my reward, my comfort, my power. Wow, that's heavy. Something that has been very disempowering to me got warped paradoxically as a PowerPoint. Love is transactional and priced too high, kind of like what you said, Lee, like, I don't know, you give something, you gotta give something up, you know, to take something from someone else. There's transaction here. There's no grace in this world. There's only what you earn or what you give up in the process of earning it. No dependency is safe. So there's this hyper, I do myself, like a 2-year, me do, like, and not ask anybody else to help me. There was this beyond reproach was my codependent persona. Like, I was so good at everything, nobody could question my sincerity, right? Yeah, it's an old story. There's an underlying mistrust of the physical world. I identify with my trauma heavily. And so I'm breaking that. But if you can transcend find the path and the pathology of this work, what you do is you go, okay, that is all true. But how do I take what happened to me and turn it into the most outrageous appreciation party? How do I move from life happened to me to life happened for me? What is the mythological leap of faith that I have to make? And that's where my big toe shows up. That's where what you believe about this human experience either creates the heaven or hell of your existence. And for me, life is happening for me because we are in this evolutionary movement as a human species to come into the light of our own beauty, our own truth. The love is our source code. That I can get there with science. I can get there with visceral awareness. I can trust that love is my source code. And from there, I extrapolate out that everything happens to me to bring me to this mythological appreciation of our stories and how each of us has a unique story to tell in this lifetime. And the age of consent is the moment where you decide to take control of the story you want to tell. You're no longer a victim to your story, you're the author. You take 100% responsibility for your experience, the story that you're going to live. So finding my edges, learning my boundaries has been my greatest teacher. It has created a spaciousness in my marriage for sacred intimacy that has been really a hard one for me. And I know there are a lot of women primarily, but men too, who had very rocky introductions to physical intimacy. And so to explore that with somebody I can feel, this is a real tell for me. All my years, Stephen and I have been together 25 years. It wasn't until about 3 years ago, I fell asleep on his shoulder. Now that doesn't sound like a big deal, but you can't touch me while I sleep because of what happened to me in my crib. So for me to finally fall asleep on Stephen's shoulder, when I startled about 30 minutes later, I said, "Oh, what was that?" And he goes, "You were snoring." And I said, "Oh, sorry." And he goes, No, that's the first time you've ever fallen asleep in my arms. Like, this is a big deal. Big deal. That's how much panic I felt in my body. So my body is teaching me how to discern truth. Like, I really am paying attention, maybe more than most, at what being in a body feels like, because it's been so unsafe and foreign to me for so long. So as a result, I feel like I'm mapping something. Everything I'm sharing with you is because I needed to map it for myself. So my trial has now become something that I can share with others, right? Do you see how our wounding becomes our most sacred healing medicine? But you have to be able to go from life happened to me to life happened for me. This is a fundamental construct shifting perspective. My big toe is a part of how I exist in this world through the lens of love. It is the foundational structure of my entire belief about this human story. And so boundaried love is healthy for all parties. Sacred witnessing, I see the energies below the surface, the DNA versus the drama. Because I lived in a world that was very fear-based, I was able to read the room. I knew when it was time to just disappear, how to avoid, how to stay out of trouble, because I could read other people's energy as a survival skill, right? Lee, this is when you are on that edge of survival, you learn to read the room. You learn to feel where trust is in your own belly, right? Now I look at that and I go, wow, that's a superpower, because what it does is it's through the lens of love, not fear. It's an awareness. It's a central nervous system connection that I feel with other people when I'm in sacred service with them, that creates this safety, this nest where they have a hypervigilance. I can gently bring them out of their hypervigilance because I've mapped it in my own story. I know what it feels like to be afraid of everything all the time, and I know how to map your way out of that too. So this is where, I understand I have empathy for all wounds. It brings me to be a bridge for others. This is where you take your woundology, what happened to you, and you look at it through a divine lens of appreciation. And you just are grateful. And you don't need to rewrite any of your story, because that would maybe take away some unique nuance, some extra dose of superpower you have. Like, why would we second guess what got us here? Why would we not want to fall in love with who we are? And if we find ourselves coming up short in some way, then we also recognize that it wasn't our fault, but it is our shared fault line. Like, we've got people that are really hurting out there who are doing a lot of damage and projection out into the world. There's going to be some reckoning with the choices that we've made individually and collectively, but we don't have to meet that with shame and blame and condemnation. We can show up and say, yeah, clean up on aisle 3. We made a mess. Do we want to keep living that way, or do we want to exercise our divine gift of free will and choose something different? So this is what's really true for me, is this is a divine comedy. When you really study what's true about the human story, it looks like this. Like you feel like something's happening to you, and then you realize, oh shit, I'm responsible for this perspective. I'm part of a collective that has not yet taken responsibility for the human experience. We're still trying to look to somebody else for making it good, bad, right, wrong. It just is. And the beauty is that we get to co-create it, because we create the construct that we tolerate. And because we're coming from such a deep, collective, passed on, epigenetically encoded 13 generations deep level of wounding to our story, we don't even see what control we have over this moment looks like. We can't even conceive the amount of power that's just resonant in all of us if we come into alignment with our own truth. We can't even imagine a world where people are not afraid of each other. And yet, doesn't that make sense? When you look at innocence, you look at babies and think they didn't grow up with, armor on. They didn't come into the world as armadillos ready to fight off everything. That shell, that armament, that attachment to safety in things outside of ourselves, whether that's religion or money, what we define as success in this world, this sense of proprietary ownership and entitlement to live free of caring for those around us. I mean, we are so traumatized that we are operating in survival mode all around us. I know you can see this because we just mapped what that looks like for us individually and how we come to the other side of it. And from my lens, the only way we get to the other side of this is to fall in love with trust from within, trust our own inner guidance systems, our bio-navigation systems. I'm reading this wonderful book right now that I will unpack later. Maybe we'll do a book club. Wouldn't that be fun? Maybe one book a month to really, this one is by David Hawkins, Power versus Force. And it's the unpacking of sort of the whole levels of consciousness and where they show up on a scale, calibrated against our own visceral knowing that love calibrates higher than fear, and that fear calibrates higher than hate. Like there's a scale, and that this scale has been calibrated by thousands of humans over time, that we trust it now. And there is a level of trust, a threshold of trust that each of us has to cross. I call it crossing the Rubicon of self-love. Like you have to be willing to burn the bridge to really fall in love with yourself, to stop allowing anything to get in the way of just trusting that you are enough. This, falling in love with self is probably a whole night, because I know how hard it is to map that. People ask me all the time, I don't know what it means to love myself. And that is the work of not going to why we don't love ourselves, but asking all the questions that identify the underlying contradictions to the idea that we even ask that question. What gets in the way of us not trusting the healing process? That's where we need to go first. So this is my final thought for tonight, and that is that a new story beckons. That feeling in our bellies that keeps us trusting the breadcrumbs, trusting the synchronicities, trusting that life is happening for us, not to us, has gotten us to this collective awareness. We're starting to really lean into trusting each other. And here's the reality, that we are both the lock and the key. We are the keeper and the kept. We are the wonder and the wanderer. We encompass it all. It isn't happening to us. We created this path to wholeness. We are the light and the shadow of our story, the writer and the reader, the observer and the observed. Nothing more is needed than to be here now. So are you ready to consent to the human experience? This is the work, and it's held in the word work, but really what it is trust. And the idea that trusting ourselves has work associated with it is also one of those paradoxical mind fucks that we've got to unpack, because falling in love with ourselves should be the easiest thing we ever get to do, right? Do we love ourselves enough to heal should be the automatic yes. But the idea that we even have to ask the question tells us how far we are from this moment in our truth, our fact-finding hero's journey, following the breadcrumbs of our soul. We'll get there eventually, but some of us are going to get there sooner rather than later. And it's because we're here to hold the door open for others. May it be so. May it be love. Oh,
May it be so.
Any final thoughts, my beauties? Go ahead, Karen.
Oh, I was going to say this was lovely because it weaves into some of the things I've been working on. And I'm also almost ready to do this.
Yeah. I appreciate that.
It is 11:44 for me.
It's almost midnight.
But this was, yes, and I was going to say, I was really touched by the relationship you two have. And it just, that energy of love and intimacy kind of spills over, and I can feel it. So thank you for sharing.
Oh, well, I appreciate the intimacy of tonight's conversation. This is pretty sweet. And I feel like I'm blessed every day to have Lee in my life. She is such a powerful ally in this process. And so thank you for seeing that about us. Yeah. Miss Lee, how about for you?
Oh, I have such an appreciation for both of you. It was, I appreciate you sharing some of your own intimate story, Karen, and so much of your story, Edie, and going through the timeline and the legend again. I, noticing different things and understanding more things. It was a really nice conversation today.
Mm. Going through our timeline should be, I use that term, soul cartographer, like we're just sort of Lewis and Clarking our way through this story, like understanding, how rivers flow and how trees grow and how life is, there is no shame in this healing process. The hashtag shameless healing has to become our mantra, that it's not our fault that we are where we are, but it is our collective fault line if we don't become accountable to our future rather than attached to our past. And so that's the big shift, is this trusting ourselves to heal this planet is going to be something that is the passion driver for getting through the hard times ahead. Like, if you know you're part of a healing solution, you will dig in, you will roll up your sleeves, you will do the thing that brings more comfort and ease to each other. Stephen and I are like, I want to bring in a refugee family. I want to find a way to hi, John. I want to find a way to engage, not just teach, but engage our resources in a healing way across this planet, because I'm passionate about this. I can't imagine waking up every day feeling dispassionate about life, and yet I've been there, and I know you too, Lee. We've struggled with wanting to be here. And so if unpacking our timelines out loud, if holding it all through this lens of love is the way that we decide that we really want to be here, then any amount of discomfort along the way in that releasing of the shame and the ego death of the old story, if we do it together, it's just so much easier, so much more compassionate, and so much more opportunity to take the shame out of it by just. So yeah, I share, and you share, and Karen shares, and there is no shame in telling our stories. This is what we need to do. It's a very indigenous way of healing, and to witness that with another is the greatest gift that we can give. So I offer that to you as a witness and as a recipient of your witnessing. There is no greater gift. Love you both. See you soon. I'm still dreaming into next week. I think boundaries is the next big topic. All right,
we
my
know
loves.
it'll be inspiring. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Be well.
Love you.
Mwah.
Bye-bye.